You think Apple makes money selling iPhones. The glass slab, the camera bump, the line outside the store before sunrise on launch day, and in raw dollars, you're not wrong. The iPhone is the single biggest product the company has by a wide margin. But here's the twist. The fastest growing, highest margin part of Apple isn't a thing you can hold at all. It's everything that happens after you buy the phone. Apple increasingly makes its money not from selling you the device, but from owning the 2.5 billion devices already out there. And that business is roughly twice as profitable as the hardware everyone lines up for. Here's how it looks from the outside. Apple is the iPhone company. In fiscal 2024, Apple sold about $391 billion of products and services. And the iPhone alone was about $201 billion of that, roughly 51%, more than half the entire company in one product. Add the Mac, the iPad, the watch, the AirPods, and the picture seems obvious. Apple designs beautiful, expensive hardware, sells it at a healthy markup, and does it at staggering scale, and the hardware really is a money machine. Apple's products carried a gross margin around 37% in fiscal 2024, extraordinary for physical electronics, where most rivals fight over single-digit margins on a laptop or a phone. So the casual story writes itself. Make gorgeous gadgets, charge a premium, repeat every September. Sell the phone, book the profit, move on to the next one. It's the most valuable hardware franchise in history, and the scale only makes the story more convincing. 2.5 billion devices in active use around the world, hundreds of millions of new phones a year. Surely that river of hardware is where the money is. But watch what happens after the sale, because that's where the story turns. When you buy an iPhone, you don't just buy a phone, you walk into a world, the App Store. iCloud storage, Apple Music, Apple TV, Apple Care, Apple Pay. The advertising, the cut of every paid app and subscription you sign up for. None of that is the phone. All of it is revenue that keeps arriving for years after the phone is paid off. And dollar for dollar, it is far more profitable than the device itself. That is not a side business. It is quietly becoming the main one. So where is the money really moving? Into a segment Apple simply calls services, App Store commissions, iCloud, Apple Music, Apple TV, Apple Care, advertising, payments, and licensing. In fiscal 2024, services brought in about $96 billion, already Apple's second biggest revenue line, behind only the iPhone, and growing about 13% in a single year, while the rest of the company barely moved. But revenue isn't the headline, margin is. In fiscal 2024, Apple's products ran a gross margin around 37%. Its services ran a gross margin around 74%. Read those two numbers again. Services keeps almost twice as much profit out of every dollar as the hardware does. So even though services is only about a quarter of Apple's revenue, it punches far above that in actual profit. Apple's total gross profit that year was about $180 billion, and services threw off something on the order of $70 billion of it. Roughly 40 cents of every profit dollar from about a quarter of the sales. The thing with no factory, no shipping, no glass and aluminum, is carrying close to half the profit. And the reason that margin is so high comes straight from how the App Store collects. When you buy a paid app, or pay for something inside one, Apple takes a commission off the top before the developer sees a cent, standardly 30%. Apple didn't build the app or take on any inventory. It runs the storefront, processes the payment, and keeps its cut. Almost all of that commission is profit, because the marginal cost of ringing up one more digital sale on infrastructure Apple already owns is close to nothing. Stretch that 30% skim across millions of apps and the billions of transactions they generate, and you can see why a business with no factory throws off margins a hardware company can only envy. And here's why this matters more every single year. The iPhone is enormous, but in rich markets the number of phones sold barely grows. Most people who want one already have one. Services is the opposite. It climbed from about $85 billion to about $96 billion in 1 year, and it kept climbing, crossing $100 billion for the first time the very next fiscal year. It grows because it doesn't depend on selling a new phone to a new person. It depends on the phones already out there, billing quietly, month after month. That's the shift hiding inside the headline. The device is roughly flat. The high-margin business attached to the device is the part still climbing, and it has barely slowed down. By the most recent full year, services was running at more than $100 billion a year, and still growing by double digits, while a single quarter of services revenue had climbed past $30 billion on its own. Put that another way, Apple now earns more in 3 months from things you can't hold than most of the world's largest companies earn from everything they do in a year. The hardware made Apple famous. The invisible business is what keeps the profit growing, and here's the part almost nobody sees. One of the most profitable lines inside that services number is a single default setting. Google pays Apple to be the search engine that opens when you tap the Safari address bar. According to unsealed documents in the United States government's antitrust case against Google, that payment reached about $20 billion in a single year, 2022. $20 billion for a default. A Google witness in that case said Google hands Apple roughly 36% of the search ad revenue it earns through Safari. Apple didn't build a search engine. It owns the screen the search starts on, and it is paid enormously simply for being first. And to see just how valuable that default slot is, look at what a rival was willing to offer for it. According to the same court documents, Microsoft, which runs the competing search engine Bing, tried for years to pry Apple away from Google. According to testimony in that case, a Microsoft executive said the company at one point offered to hand Apple essentially all of the search revenue Bing would earn, just to become the default in Safari instead. Apple stayed with Google. Think about what that tells you. Companies were lining up to pay tens of billions of dollars a year, or to give away nearly all the revenue, for the right to be the first box you see when you search on an iPhone. That box is one of the single most valuable pieces of real estate in technology, and Apple owns it without writing a line of search code. Now, why does this work, and why can't most hardware companies pull it off? Because the iPhone isn't really the product Apple is selling, it's the entrance fee to a relationship. Sell a phone once, and you've placed a device in someone's pocket that they will carry every waking hour for years. Apple has said there are now more than 2.5 billion active Apple devices in the world, up from about 2.25 billion just 2 years earlier. That installed base is the real asset. Each device is a doorway, and services revenue flows through it, month after month, app after app, subscription after subscription. And services has the kind of economics hardware can only dream of. When you pay for another month of iCloud, Apple doesn't have to manufacture anything, ship anything, or assemble anything. The cost of delivering one more month of storage, or taking a commission on one more app sale, is close to nothing. That's why the services margin sits around 74%, while a phone has to be designed, sourced, built, shipped and stocked before it earns a cent. The App Store is the clearest case. That standard 30% commission drops to 15% for most small developers and for many subscriptions after the first year, but the model holds. Apple owns the marketplace developers have to sell through, and it takes a cut of every sale. Multiply a cut like that across millions of apps and billions of devices, and you have a toll booth on the entire mobile economy. And the toll never stops collecting. A game that earns money for a decade pays Apple a cut for a decade. A subscription you forget to cancel pays Apple a slice every single month automatically, for as long as you keep it. Apple built the road once. Everyone who drives on it keeps paying, year after year, and the cost to Apple of waving each one through is almost nothing. The search default works the same way, just bigger. Apple isn't competing in search. It simply controls the most valuable real estate in search, the default slot on billions of iPhones, and rents it out. The money arrives whether you ever think about it or not. That is what high margin really means here. Revenue that doesn't need a factory, a truck, or even your attention, so the relationship between the two halves is the whole trick. The expensive hardware, sold at a premium, isn't just a profit center. It's a customer acquisition machine. Every phone sold plants a new node in a network that services then earns from for years. The hardware wins the customer. The services keep billing them. And because the customer already owns the phone, leaving means abandoning their photos, their messages, their apps, their subscriptions, their whole digital life. The installed base doesn't just generate revenue. It locks it in. That's why Apple can keep raising the ceiling on services even when phone sales in mature markets barely grow. The phones are already out there. The meter is already running. And notice that this installed base isn't holding steady. It's compounding. Apple has said active devices climbed from about 2.25 billion in early 2020, to more than 2.5 billion by early 2026. That's 250 million more doorways for services to bill through, opened in 2 years. The more your life lives on those devices, the more expensive it becomes to walk out. The growth in services isn't really a sales story. It's the natural output of an installed base that keeps getting larger and harder to leave. You can see how valuable that tool has become by watching who tries to take it and who tries to shrink it. In the courtroom, the Google payment survived. After the court found Google had monopolized search, the judge still allowed Google to keep paying Apple for default placement, only bearing the long exclusive contracts and forcing the deal to be renegotiated far more often. The payment to Apple itself wasn't the crime. It was simply judged too useful to consumers and partners to ban outright. Across the Atlantic, European regulators went after the App Store Commission instead. Under the Digital Markets Act, Apple now has to let developers steer customers to other payment methods, and it has restructured its European fees around that. But notice the shape of the response. The cut gets smaller, or it gets renamed, or it gets split into new fees, but the take rate model survives. Even regulators so far have trimmed the toll rather than removed it. That tells you how central it is. And the engine keeps widening. Apple bundles its subscriptions, music, television, storage, fitness, games, into a single package designed to make you keep more than one. It runs an advertising business inside the App Store, charging developers to appear at the top of a search you do for an app. It earns on Apple Pay and on Apple Care. Every one of these is the same idea, wearing a different coat. Own the platform, then charge for access to the people already standing on it. The phone got them through the door once. Services charges them gently and repeatedly for staying. So here's what Apple really is. Not a gadget company that sells a few services on the side, but a recurring revenue business that uses the most desirable hardware on earth as the way in. The iPhone gets you through the door. Services is what the house earns once you're inside, and once you can see that shape, you start spotting it across the whole industry. The device is sold once, but the relationship is sold forever, and the relationship is where the high-margin money lives. The game console sold cheap, so the games aren't. The printer sold cheap, so the ink isn't. The coffee machine that only takes its own pods. Apple just runs the most elegant version of it ever built, on the most loved product on the planet, at a scale no one else can touch. The thing they hand you at the counter is the beginning of the bill, not the end of it. Next time, we sit down with a company that gives away its main product entirely, search that costs you nothing, and somehow turns that free service into one of the largest profit machines ever built. That's Google. And free was never the point.